Buenas tardes, good afternoon. It is my great pleasure, I am Alberto Díaz-Calleros. I'm a senior fellow at the Center for Democracy, Development and Rule of Law. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's event, The Power of Long-View Leadership, a conversation with Juan Manuel Santos, the former president of Colombia. This event is hosted by the Center on Democracy, Development and Rule of Law in partnership with the Business, Government and Society Initiative at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, and also together with the Center for Latin American Studies here at Stanford University. Today's conversation will be an exploration of how power and the necessity of long-term thinking in leadership. We will think and hopefully reflect on how leaders can rise above their short-term pressures to build sustainable peace, inclusive development, and lasting democratic institutions. This discussion is especially timely and vital today as we confront some global challenges, not only here in the United States, but throughout the hemisphere and in the world, that demand both moral courage and a strategic vision. We hope that this event will spark some ideas, some reflection, and some open dialogue on the kind of leadership that our world so desperately needs right now and also in the years to come. Following the remarks by President Santos, my colleague Héctor Hoyos, who is a professor of Iberian and Latin American cultures and comparative literature, and also he is the faculty director of the Center for Latin American Studies, and he's also the director of the Center for the Study of the Nobel, okay, Nobel with a V. We have a lot of trouble, Spanish speakers, with this. Okay. Nobel with a V will moderate a discussion and take questions from our audience. Today, we're honored to be joined by President Juan Manuel Santos, who served as President of Colombia from 2010 to 2018. He was the sole recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize in 2016 for, and I quote, his resolute efforts to bring the country's more than 50-year-long civil war to an end, end quote. Before becoming president, he was Colombia's Minister of Foreign Trade. He was the Minister of Finance. He was the Minister of Defense. President Santos graduated from the Colombian Naval Academy in Cartagena. He holds a business and economics degree from the University of Kansas and completed postgraduate studies at the London School of Economics, the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and at Harvard University, where he obtained a master's in public administration at the Kennedy School. He is currently the chairman of the board of Compass Foundation, which he created to contribute to peace building in Colombia. He's a member of the board of the International Crisis Group, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the Wildlife Conservation Society, and also a member of the Global Commission on Drug Policy and the Planetary Guardians. In November 2024, he was appointed chair of the Elders, an organization founded by Nelson Mandela to advocate for peace, justice, human rights, and a sustainable planet. Gracias por acompañarnos. I want to say on behalf also of those of us who are Latin American faculty, who are Latin American students here, and also the Latin American staff, the service workers, all the people that are part of our Stanford community. Agradecemos la visita. We feel so honored that one of the great persons in Latin America today is here with us. Muchas gracias, Presidente Santos. And please join me in welcoming President Santos.
Well, thank you very much for such a kind introduction, and it's a great honor to be here at this great university. They told me I had around 20 minutes. I would have liked 2 or 3 hours, but I know that everybody is pressed for time. And I thought, and my experience is that sharing with the students and with you some stories, some anecdotes is the best way to transmit lessons on leadership, on negotiation. So that's what I'm going to do in the next 20 minutes. I would like to start by telling you my first and very important lesson in leadership. that was in the Naval Academy. When I arrived, one of the officers said, "Get this sailboat and learn how to sail." And I had no idea of how to sail. And I started struggling with the sailboat. He was laughing and said, "Come here. The first thing you need to know if you want to be a good Marine," I was in the Marines, "and a good sailor, is that you need to know where you want to go. Have a port of destination. You can use the winds that are favorable or even the winds that are against you to get to where you want to go. But you have to know where you want to go." And he said, "This is a lesson not only to be a good sailor. This is a lesson for your personal life, for your family, for your business, or for governments. You need to know where you want to go." Many years later, I was Minister of Trade, the first Minister of Trade of Colombia. We opened the economy, and we wanted to attract investment. And I was in New York in a conference full of businessmen selling Colombia, saying how attractive Colombia would be for foreign investment. And in the middle of the conference, news of a bomb in a commercial center in Bogota arrived, and of course everybody was very affected, and so were we, so was I. The conference did not go very well because of that. And the CEO of a very important company came to me and said, "Listen, Minister, you have a great story about your country, but as long as you have this war, real investment will not go to Colombia." A few years later, after finishing my Ministry of Foreign Trade, I had been elected chair of the United Nations Conference for Trade and Development, the UNCTAD. And that was the 8th UNCTAD, and the 9th UNCTAD, the chair was Nelson Mandela, who was at that time president of South Africa. And so I had to go to Johannesburg to officially give the chair to Mandela. That morning, I arrived, turned on the television in South Africa, and saw a surreal live program. For the first time, the victims and the perpetrators in that war were getting together. And they were filming that and transmitting that in live television. And some of them embraced, others shouted at each other. It was really surreal. That afternoon, I was programmed to have a 15-minute meeting with Mandela and given the chair. Well, I spent 4.5 hours. He taught me about why that program was so important, because they wanted to bring victims and perpetrators together in order for them to reconcile for the future. And after the most interesting conversation I've had in my life about peacemaking and about the need for peace, he said at the very end, "But listen, South Africa and Colombia, they are similar countries. Your country will never take off if you don't make peace." And at that moment, I chose what the officer some years before in the Navy had told me, that one had to do a port of destination. Where I wanted to go, I said, that will be my port of destination. So I started studying about how to make peace. Peace processes all around the world, some who were successful, others that failed. And all my predecessors, presidents, had tried to make peace with the most powerful and oldest guerrilla movement in the whole of the Western Hemisphere, the FARC. And I then discovered some common denominators, things that I could apply to Colombia if I had the opportunity to contribute to the peace process. I identified the conditions that were necessary for a peace process in Colombia. What had my predecessors done wrong? What could I bring from other examples in the world? And I had the opportunity of starting to create those conditions. There were three. As long as the guerrillas think that they will win through violence, they will never sit down in good faith. So they have to be convinced that they will never achieve power through violence. Second, that the leaders of the guerrillas, the sort of board of directors of the guerrillas themselves personally would have to have personal interest in negotiating peace and not continuing the war. And third, in any asymmetrical war in the world, you need the support of the region. As if the neighbors don't support the peace process, the insurgents, the guerrillas, will always use those neighbors as a safeguard, and they will not be pressed to make peace. Well, I was later on, because I created a political party in Colombia which broke 157 years of history. For the first time, a political party won the majority in the Senate and in the House after the conservatives and liberals had always monopolized the Congress, and I was named Minister of Defense. And I had already identified the conditions. The military balance of power had to be in the side of the state. The commanders of the guerrillas had to be convinced. So I said, how do I do this? Well, I started a strategy on operations and especially on intelligence. I went to the UK, to London. I was a good friend of the then British Prime Minister, Tony Blair. And I told him, please help me with what the English are known for to be the best in the world. And he said, and what is that? Intelligence. And he sent me a team of MI6. I went to Washington. Same thing, CIA, Israel, the Mossad. And I changed completely the intelligence of Colombia and the military and the government. And that made a tremendous difference in the effectiveness of the armed forces against the guerrillas. At the same time, I did something that a former commander of the army had told me at the beginning of my ministry. He came to me and said, I know that you want peace, but you are now in the position of making war, of having to be successful in making war. I will give you an advice. Treat the FARC, the guerrillas, not as your enemies, but as your adversaries. And I said, and what is the difference? I said, there's a great difference. Enemies you eliminate, adversaries you beat. But you have to be conscious that you will have to live with them for the rest of your lives. So treat them as human beings. They have mothers, they have fathers. So fight with them, but they're human beings. And I understood exactly what he was saying. And I changed the whole doctrine, the military doctrine. And instead of, we had inherited from the US this, what we call the Vietnam strategy. How many bodies do we have every day? I said, we changed that. We're going to change it. How many guerrillas demobilize and come to our side? And how many are captured? And in the last resort, kill them. That was a completely different doctrine. But I explained to the military, who were very surprised, that that had a very important strategic message. A dead guerrilla becomes a victim. A demobilized guerrilla, he becomes a source of worry. Why is he leaving? And he brings us very useful information. Anyway, all of this worked, and I finished my Ministry of Defense. I was extremely popular because we were very effective on capturing or bringing down the heads, the commanders of the guerrillas, and the guerrillas were very much weakened. And that's when I said, let's start a negotiation. Well, I was elected president after being Minister of Defense, and one of the reasons is because I was a war hero. We were very effective in the war against the FARC. And so when I mentioned that I wanted to sit down and negotiate peace, everybody said, no, don't do it. All of your predecessors have failed. You will lose your political capital. Look what happened to the other presidents. And even my family were saying, no, Dad, no, don't do it. But I was convinced that that was my objective. And there was a marvelous person. He was a former minister of foreign relations of Israel, Shlomo Ben-Ami, who said, listen, I know everybody's saying, don't do it. Continue making war. You're good at it. You're a hero. You were elected with the highest number of votes in the history of Colombia because you're a war hero. But you want peace. And think about this. Put yourself the day you're going to go to your grave and think back and ask yourself, how many lives would you have saved if I had taken the risk and had been successful in making peace? Would you go to the grave with your conscience at peace? And that argument convinced me to go ahead, and I did it. I lost my political capital, but I sat down with the guerrillas, the FARC. There was another lesson that I learned. They had always used the ceasefire, the negotiations, to acquire more power and to acquire more, not only military, but political power. And so they started asking for a ceasefire. I said, no ceasefire, because I had already changed the correlation of military forces in favor of the state. So I said, we will have a ceasefire when we have an agreement. And nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. And I said, this is the Rabin doctrine. And they said, what is the Rabin doctrine? I said, that is exactly what Prime Minister Rabin in Israel told Arafat when he sat down with him to negotiate. I will negotiate with you as if there is no terrorism, but I will continue to fight terrorism as if there is no negotiation, no peace negotiation. And so differentiating the two was the decision. Very difficult, because to negotiate in the middle of the war makes the process very difficult in terms of convincing the public opinion that that is the way to go about, especially when we had all these precedents of failures in the negotiations. But that in the end worked very well. Now, why were we successful in achieving an agreement? Well, because, first of all, we created the conditions that we had identified before. Another thing is we had very clear objectives of how to do it, and our red lines. We will not negotiate, for example, the armed forces had always been spoilers because the governments, all of my predecessors thought that the armed forces, the military, would be against the peace process, because usually in any peace process around the world, the first thing they negotiate is what to do with the armed forces, and they were completely against negotiating with their adversaries or enemies their future. So I said, a red line, I will not negotiate the armed forces with the guerrillas, and not only that, I will put 2 generals as the part of the negotiating team to guarantee the armed forces that they will not be negotiated. That was extremely important, because then we had the support of the armed forces instead of being spoilers. Another very important thing that we did, and that's part of a theory of negotiation, is you always have to have a view from a balcony, a view from a distance that is not involved in the day-to-day difficulties of the process. So I chose a series of international advisors with hands-on experience in negotiations. That would be my advisors, not even the negotiating team, my advisors. One of them was this former Minister of Foreign Relations, Shlomo Ben-Ami, who had been the architect of the Camp David Agreement. The other one, his name is Jonathan Powell, had been the Chief of Staff of Tony Blair and the chief negotiator with the Northern Ireland peace agreement. The third one was Joaquin Villalobos. He was the commander of the Salvadorian guerrillas, negotiator of the Salvadorian peace process. And the fourth one was a professor of negotiation, William Murray. I had met him in Harvard, and he was the fourth advisor. And that was extremely important, because the advice they gave me was not tainted by the difficulties of the day-to-day political situation in the peace process. One very important aspect in a negotiation is to get to know and understand the other part. Why were they fighting? What were their concerns? What were their worries? And it's extremely important to get to know them, and it's extremely important to build trust. And we did that. Slowly, they started to trust us. You build trust through gestures. We did many gestures in order for them to be more open, and we established a very good relationship, in a very good dialogue, and especially between the guerrillas and the military, to the extent that at the end of the negotiations, when we started what they call the DDR, demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration, they said, we want the soldiers and police that have been fighting for 50 years to be the ones in charge of our security after we give up our weapons. That was unprecedented. And that was extremely important to give the process legitimacy. Another aspect that was very important. This is the first agreement negotiated under the umbrella of something called the Rome Statute. This is an international agreement that was negotiated back in the early 90s to facilitate peace processes, and that allowed countries to apply what is called transitional justice, which is a different type of justice that has been applied around the world. It's a reparative more than punitive justice. Difficult to understand and to accept, but very important to be able to reach agreements, and at the same time, and this is crucial, giving the victims of any conflict the rights that they cherish, which are the rights that have been established in the Rome Statute to justice, to the truth, to reparations, and to non-repetition. It was the first agreement that was negotiated under this Rome Statute, and that gave the process tremendous legitimacy worldwide. The UN got very interested, the Security Council got involved, the Secretary General went many times to Colombia saying, this is a great precedent that you're creating, and today still considered the most comprehensive and most audacious peace process ever negotiated. I can tell you many things about how we went about reaching an agreement, the difficulties we had, we confronted, for example, a situation which was very, I would say, contradictory. We reached an agreement, and I had promised the Colombian people that I would put the agreement to a referendum. And I was absolutely convinced that everybody would vote yes. Well, I lost by a small margin, but they voted no. I underestimated something that is very much in fashion today, the power of fake news. The enemies of the peace agreement were very effective in selling the peace agreement as the disaster that we would give the country to communism, that we were going to do away with private property, and even the church bought one of the lies because we had introduced in the agreement something called the gender chapter to give the women victims special treatment, because usually in the wars, the women are the ones who suffer the most. And so we introduced a chapter called the gender chapter, and the fake news changed that, saying that we were introducing in a disguised way something called the ideology of gender, which is a theory whereby you are not born a boy or a girl. It's during your life that you choose if you want to be a boy or a girl. And that in every religion was a sacrilege. But the prosecutor general, who was from the opposing party, had said that this is ideology of gender. And so a week before the referendum, all the priests around the country were saying, vote no, vote no. To the extent that Pope Francis, who was also a great ally in the peace process, I went many times to visit him. I used to tell him that why would he not go to Colombia to give me some help. And he used to say, President, don't worry, I pray a lot for you. And I said, well, that means I'm in real trouble if you have to pray for me. And he said, no, I pray for you, but I will go in the moment that you, but especially the Colombian people, will need me most. And he went to Colombia, but he chose to go after we signed the peace agreement, after the guerrillas had handed their weapons, they disarmed, and he then said, I'm going to Colombia to push the Colombians in the most difficult path, to give the first step in the most difficult path, which is the path of reconciliation. And he was completely right. That is the most difficult path in every peace process, how to reconcile in order to have peace in the long run. I can continue telling you stories about the peace process, but the key is planning, knowing who you are negotiating with, establishing what Nelson Mandela used to call constructive dialogue. Constructive dialogue means you sit down and learn from the person you are trying to reach some kind of agreement, learn from them why do they think and why do they behave the way they behave. And that we did. And we are right now in that very difficult process of reconciliation. The implementation of the peace process had not been very successful, but still the agreement is considered one of the most comprehensive and best agreements that has been negotiated. Now this, and I will finish with a step I'm going to take in another area. I am chair of the elders. This is a group that Nelson Mandela created. Jimmy Carter was one of the founders. I was in his funeral some months ago. We are advocating peace, human rights, no war, no nuclear war, nuclear negotiations, and climate change. Well, I was invited at the beginning of this year as chair of the elders to unveil something called the Doomsday Clock. The Doomsday Clock is something that Einstein and Oppenheimer, the inventors of the atomic bomb, launched when they were worried about the consequences of their invention. And they went to the University of Chicago and told some scientists, listen, we want to leave somebody monitoring what is going to happen with our invention, because we are very afraid that this could be very, very bad for the planet. Well, these scientists got together and they created something called the Bulletin of Nuclear Scientists, which every year, for the last 77 years, they use the analogy of a clock, and they move the clock closer or farther from midnight. Midnight is doomsday, according to what is happening. The only criteria until the late 90s was the possibility of an atomic war, the nuclear war. They changed it with the Cuban missile crisis, very much towards midnight, then changed it back when Reagan and Gorbachev made an agreement, or when Kennedy and Khrushchev made an agreement. They've been moving the clock back and forth. They added climate change at the end of the 90s as an existential threat for the planet. And more recently, 7, 8 years ago, they added AI, artificial intelligence, also as an existential threat. Well, I was invited to unveil the hour of this year, as I said at the beginning of this year, and to our surprise, they had moved it to 89 seconds to midnight, the closest ever in 77 years. And I asked them after the ceremony, it was full of journalists. I went to have lunch with the scientists and asked them, why? Why did you move it? And they started explaining in a fascinating conversation the reasons. For example, the threat or the risk of a nuclear war right now has increased dramatically because of technology, because of the number of nuclear warheads that have been built, because of the countries that have right now nuclear power. Even right now today, India and Pakistan are about to go to war, and both have nuclear power. And that is a very high risk. But they also explained climate change. I don't have to explain to you what has happened with climate change. And AI. It was a great and interesting discussion about how AI can be very beneficial, but also very, very dangerous for humanity. And they gave me one military example that has to do with the nuclear risk. More and more, the military are depending on AI to take their decisions already. And they said, if any nuclear power delegates to AI the decision to push the button, that can be manipulated. And we can have a nuclear war because of AI. Well, all these problems, climate change, AI has also, and what they call cyber security, has also a lot to do with the pandemics. What happened with the pandemics is an example of the risk and the threats we have. And to conclude, how can we mitigate those risks? And how can we do what we did in Colombia, but at the world stage? That is the great challenge. And that's when dialogue is imperative. And again, quoting Mandela, the most powerful weapon in the world is to sit down and talk. And that is what is needed right now. That the world leaders, instead of competing among each other to see who wins this or who wins that, they have to sit down and talk about how can we work together to avoid a nuclear war, to control climate change, to hopefully regulate AI, to avoid, or not to avoid, to mitigate the next pandemic, because all the scientists say that it's not if it comes, it will come, but when and how strong will the next pandemic be? And we need cooperation. Unfortunately, what is happening around the world is the contrary. The multilateral system, the respect for the rule of law, the respect for protocols and agreements is going down and down. So the big challenge right now of the world, and of the world in more than 140 conflicts that the world has right now, armed conflicts, is to sit down and talk with very, in a very constructive way. That is what we need. Long-term leadership that takes decision not according to the next election, but according to the next generation's threat or challenge in order to be able to solve their problems. And that is what is needed right now. I will finish here and thank you very much.
By way of a transition, before we have a Q&A, I'd like to share a couple of anecdotes and also salute President Santos on his address for us here today. I want to highlight for us all, as I was making notes, as I'm sure several of you were, how war and negotiation are not the same thing, and yet there are connecting veins between these two domains that have been masterfully exposed for us here. This is an educational institution. I was reminded when the plebiscite indeed flopped to the chagrin of so many of us. The law school students at the time invited Professor Larry Diamond and myself for a conversation, because this was also around the time of Brexit. And so we were raking our brains here trying to understand how could Brexit happen? How could the plebiscite in Colombia fall? And of course, we didn't come to a solution, and I think that we're all still working together inside and outside of academia. I know for a fact, President Santos, that you care a lot about education. One way I know this is, full disclosure, you are in the company of nerds here. And I myself, I'm a nerd. I happen to be a Colombian nerd at that. And I got a letter from you in 1996 when I had a high score in the Colombian equivalent of the SATs, and you were not even a candidate. You went around and sent these handwritten letters to recipients of high SAT scores, as it were. And I want to thank you publicly for that lovely gesture that did go a long way. We now have time for a few questions from the audience. I want to maximize the time for Q&A, and so I'll keep my receipts very, very brief, my remarks rather very brief. If you have a question, please form a line behind one of the two microphones in the aisles. Before we begin, I kindly ask everyone to keep your questions brief and focused on the topic of today's conversation, namely leadership and long-term visions for leadership. We want to allow as many voices as possible to participate in this dialogue. So please, please, please keep your comments concise, pose them as questions rather than statements. So let's begin. Who would like to start us off? Ma'am.
President Santos, I'm honored to see you in person. Thank you so much for sharing. I'm an art of living teacher, and we talk a lot about the peace efforts by Sri Ravi Shankar also in the between FARC and Colombia state. My question is, if you were to repeat this peace process, where would you choose to do that, and what would be your advice?
Well, if I was going to repeat, I would be much more, I would wish to be more effective in explaining what we're doing. And that is applicable to any public policy. You need to say why you are doing it and what is it that you're doing for people to understand and accept it. And because we did not do that enough, the fake news beat us in the referendum. Another thing that I would have done differently is I was advised, we negotiated an agenda of 6 points. And we decided to negotiate sequentially. The first point, and until we have an agreement, the first point, we go to the second point. That was a mistake, because that prolonged the negotiation for about 6 years. And any negotiation, any peace process is very difficult to manage anywhere in the world. I remember when they said, they told me, you're going to lose your political capital, and I lost it, because any negotiation of this sort boils down to one thing. Where do you draw the line between peace and justice? How much justice are you willing to sacrifice in order to have peace? And no matter where you draw the line, there will always be people who claim more justice or people who claim more peace with good arguments. So the longer the process takes, the more difficult it is to maintain the people supporting the process. I would say that those two things I would do differently.
And where would you choose? Sorry.
I'm sorry, sir.
Señor Presidente, muchísimas gracias por estar acá. Mi nombre es Elkin, soy de Bucaramanga. I just had a question regarding the past peace processes that happened in Colombia, el proceso del Caguán with Pastrana, and then the not so much a peace process, but more the different stance that Presidente Uribe took during his years. What lessons do you take from those two peace processes, and did you apply any of them when you were trying to achieve peace?
The peace process before ours.
El de Pastrana y
Yeah.
also the approach
Well,
that Uribe took.
First of all, and we're living that right now, any peace process with these type of interlocutors needs a carrot and a stick. And you have to combine both. You cannot concentrate on one or the other. I would say that the Pastrana peace process, the biggest mistake was to put an agenda which was impossible to negotiate, and he started by giving the guerrillas the territory the size of Switzerland. So they were very much empowered. And like I said at the beginning, you need to weaken them and to take them to the negotiating table, otherwise they will never negotiate in good faith. That, I would say, that is the lesson from the past two processes.
Thank you.
Sir?
Hi, sir. Thank you for sharing your story. My name is Vipara, an MBA 1 student from Laos. Now, throughout your career and life, you've faced many challenges and battles. My question is, have you ever felt fearful? And if so, how do you overcome it? And what drives you to overcome that?
Have I felt?
Fearful.
For your life and your
Oh,
family?
yes, yes. I was warned, for example, the Rabin doctrine. They told me, this is going to cost you your political capital, and it could cost you your life. Rabin was assassinated because of the peace process. But fear or courage is a decision. You're not born with it. You take a decision. And you evaluate your risks, and you take decisions. And of course, not only more than myself, my family was my concern. But those are the risks you have to take in order to, like the example I put, how many lives would I have not saved if I had been fearful and not taken the decision?
Okay, thank you.
President, thank you for being here. I'm Chilean. I used to work with President Piñera. He always spoke greatly about you, and I think you both have a lot of things in common, like how you acted on convictions more than on popularity, on tough moments in time. And my question, like taking it to today's, we've seen the world polarizing more and people like leaving their convictions behind to like go for like votes, and we've seen the extremes kind of rising. Like, how do you see kind of the world going back to like the center and like to like clear convictions, or leaders that have like strong convictions and like stand by them?
About polarization.
Polarization, no.
Yeah.
This is in my view, the worst disease that the world is going through. Polarization. Polarization makes democracies unworkable. If you don't have the capacity to make transactions among different interests, then democracy simply will not deliver. And you're seeing that all around the world. Here in the United States, in Colombia, in Chile, everywhere, in Europe. And the big challenge is how to recuperate a magic word that was mentioned by George Washington in his farewell address when he said, "I would not be president for a third time." Moderation. If we lose moderation, he said 250 years ago, democracies will cease to exist. Well, that is what is happening right now. We have lost moderation. We need to recover that. And because of the social media and what is happening, it's very difficult, because the more extreme you are, the more popular you become. And that goes completely in contradiction with the spirit of democracy. Well, so this is a big challenge to universities like Stanford. Please think about how can we recuperate the popularity of moderation.
Thank you.
Before we continue, and I see we have 3 more questions, I want to pat ourselves in the back for asking such good questions and making them questions. That's unheard of. Go Stanford. Sir.
Thank you, President Santos, for coming. My name is Santiago Bustamante. I'm from Bogota.
And this is the uniform?
The uniform here, of course, 100%.
Good soccer team.
Exactly. And, well, you made massive progress in achieving peace in Colombia, in reducing violence. The numbers have changed significantly from decades ago, but Colombia is still a country that still has violence. It still has some guerrilla groups that are still active. So in your vision, if you were today in President Petro's shoes, what would be the next steps to keep pushing forward and keep improving, reducing violence in the country?
Well, unfortunately, the peace process, which is, as I said, very comprehensive, 320 pages, had very clear what the state had to do after the DDR, demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration. But in Latin America, and right now also here in the US, there's another terrible practice called what many people call the Adam's complex. Adam and Eve, the government that thinks that he's Adam and nothing, he is the creator of the world, so everything that has been done is bad. That is the worst situation for long-term policies. When you change the government and the government comes and says, no, I erase everything that has been done and I will start something new. That unfortunately happened with the implementation of the peace process, which had very clear steps to avoid what we are now suffering in Colombia because of the lack of implementation of what was agreed. And how you ask, how can we go about? Well, we did it. Remember, Colombia was a failed state in the 90s. the cartels and the guerrillas controlled a very high percentage of the territory. We were able to take control of the territories and force the guerrillas to the table through policies of security and incentives. That can still be done, even though right now it's different because these are not political organizations, these are criminal organizations. But you need an effective security policy. Not only Colombia, all of Latin America, from Mexico to Argentina, the #1 problem, and it's increasing everywhere, is the power of organized crime. They are taking over many countries. And there is a great opportunity for the US to win the Latin Americans saying, let's work together to fight organized crime, which I repeat, is the #1 problem we have, with no doubt, in all of Latin America, including the Caribbean countries, or especially in the Caribbean countries.
So the last word, as it were, goes to?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President, for being here. The story of Colombia is very inspirational. I'll keep my question short. Many other countries, as you just mentioned, in South America suffer from economic mismanagement, corruption, and violence. What is your message to these other countries to fight the demons of economic mismanagement and corruption?
The message to the other Latin American countries, well, I talk with my own experience. I am a great believer in what is called the third way, which is a theory, a political and economic theory, which in a way brings together the two competing traditional sort of forces, the market and the state. The third way says, allow the markets to operate as much as possible, but also force the state to intervene whenever it's necessary. It's a very pragmatic approach. But I'll tell you an anecdote. In 2011, I did in Cartagena a third way summit, and I invited President Clinton. He went to Cartagena. Tony Blair, the UK. Felipe González from Spain. Fernando Enrique Cardoso from Brazil. Ricardo Lagos from Chile. There was another one. Anyway, all those presidents had, in a way, applied the third way. And if you see the history, they had the best achievements, social and economic, of their countries in the last 50 years. And I would truly advise any Latin American country to find a way, it could be a third way or another way, to bring together the population. If populations don't work together, especially with the existential threats that we have right now, and in Latin America, organized crime has become an existential threat. Organized crime is a multinational, very sophisticated enterprise that in many ways, in many countries, is more powerful than the state of the countries. We have to bring together. So, bring the populations together and stop fighting among the different countries. Latin America right now is more disintegrated than ever. You see Ecuador fighting with Mexico, Colombia fighting with Peru, Argentina fighting with Brazil. In a world that we're living, that is not the way to solve the problems.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank the Stanford Business School, the Center for Democracy, Development of the Rule of Law, the Freeman Spogli Institute, and the Center for Latin American Studies, but especially to President Santos for this breath of fresh air in our campus conversation in this day and age. Thank you also to his family for making this visit possible. Thank you all.
Thank you.